What's up guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Bonnie and this is my channel where I talk about all things lifestyle and DIY. So if you're interested in either of those, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on those notifications. But today I'm going to show you guys how I made this really cool DIY workbench for my workshop. So if you want to see that, just keep watching. So I actually found the plans for this workbench on YouTube. A girl named Shannon, she built her own workbench from plans on Pinterest. So I'll link both of those accounts down below. But for this project, I used 1.5-inch screws. Then I used 2.5-inch screws. And for the lumber, I had 11 pieces of 2x4x8. I also used two different thicknesses of plywood. One is 3/4 of an inch and the other is 1/2 inch, which is going to be the bottom part of the workbench. I used poplar wood, which was honestly the cheapest that I could find at my local Home Depot, so it worked out. So this is what my current work situation looks like right now. I am using a folding table, which is honestly something that I don't want to use. It's not very stable. And I also have a table saw, which has its own stand, but I'm trying to maximize the room that I have in the garage. So using this and adding it into a workbench is my best option. I first started off by cutting out all of my pieces. I got my cut list from Shannon's YouTube channel, so I'll make sure to link that above for you guys. I did go off of the plans from bitterrootdiy.com and her post from Pinterest because we have the same exact table saw, but Ryobi no longer makes the table saw that I have, so just make sure that your cuts are going to be to the measurements of your table saw. Next, I'm going to be assembling the bottom portion of the frame. So there's going to be 3 middle support pieces and then the 2 side pieces. To secure the frame together, I'm going to be using wood glue and 2.5-inch screws. I do drill pilot holes through the studs first in order to avoid them splitting. After the frame is all put together, I start by attaching part of the legs. I do the same process with glue and 2.5-inch screws to attach it to the frame. When you are attaching the legs, just make sure you avoid the other screws that were used to attach the frame together. And I'm going to repeat this until all 4 sides are attached. Now I'm going to be attaching another leg to the side of the workbench. I'm going to be using wood glue and about 5 screws to secure it to the frame and the other leg. I'm going to repeat this process until all 4 additional legs are added to the workbench. Now I will be attaching the legs that will be the support pieces that holds up the shelf for the table saw. I secure these to the frame with 4 2.5-inch screws. Unfortunately, when I went to Home Depot, they weren't able to rip my plywood for me, so I ended up having to do that at home with my circular saw. This plywood is the 1/2-inch thick plywood, and it is the bottom shelf of the workbench. So after it was cut to size, I went ahead and I applied a good amount of wood glue and I laid down the shelf. I think I went a little overboard on securing it to the workbench, but it's better to be safe than sorry. I attached the shelf to the workbench with 1.5-inch screws. Now that that was done, I could work on the top portion of the workbench. This frame is going to be slightly different than the bottom frame only because we're going to leave an opening on one side so that the table saw can slide in. Now that it is assembled, I can go ahead and attach it to the other portion of the workbench. Since I don't have 1,000 hands, I used clamps so that I could make it level. I tried my best to get it super flush because there's going to be plywood that's going to be laid on top, and I want to make sure that that's level as well. Then I just attached it with 2.5-inch screws. Now I'm working on the shelf that will be holding up the table saw, and I'm doing the same process: wood glue, pilot holes, screws. Now I'm adding it to my workbench, and I'm just making sure that it's level before I secure it. I also had to rip the wood for the tabletop. Now I'm just kind of making sure that it fits and that it's straight as possible before I cut out the opening for the table saw. This was probably not the best way to do it, but I just flipped my table saw upside down and I traced around it to know where to cut. I then created pilot holes for my jigsaw to go into, and then I used my jigsaw to cut it out. I couldn't find the directions for the shelf for the table saw, but it is going to be 3/4 of an inch plywood. I then added the shelf to the workbench. I wanted to make sure that the table saw would sit good and that it was flush with the top before securing the shelf. Before securing the tabletop to the workbench, I decided to add the caster wheels. Something that I didn't think about was that how much height the wheels would actually add to the workbench, and since I'm a super short person, unfortunately I feel like the workbench is a little bit too tall for me, but it's okay, I will make it work. I ended up using the 2.5-inch screws with washers that I had on hand because the screws were too small and they went straight through the holes on the caster wheels. I got help from this super handsome guy that lives with me. Day 2, guys. I ended up sanding this only just a little bit with 60 grit sandpaper to get off all the roughness and the printed ink on it. And then I went back over it with a 220 grit sandpaper to prep it for stain and paint. I ended up staining the top with Provincial by Varathane. This is definitely my go-to stain right now. I use it on probably 100% of my projects at the moment, but it's just a pretty shade and I absolutely love it. I think it's very universal and it could be used for any decor style. I then went in with a foam brush for this mint green color that I decided to paint the bottom half of my workbench to get into the areas that are harder to reach or that's going to be closer to the tabletop. And then I went back in with a roller so that it would take less time. And here is the finished product, guys. I am so in love with my workbench. It has been a few weeks since I finished this, but I have used it so many times. With the built-in table saw, it's literally perfection. I've never been so much happier to have this in my workshop than I do now. I never knew what I was missing. I seriously love the caster wheels with the brakes because it just makes it so easy for me to be able to move this around and use the table saw. I love it. I love the color. I love the size of it, even though it's a bit too tall for me. It's really nice and very useful. Alright guys, that's it for today's tutorial or DIY project. If you liked it, make sure you guys hit that thumbs up button and I will see you guys next time.